So we know that with fiscal policy, the government can actually impact the macro economy. And they're doing that by one of two ways. Number one is they're going to be changing the amount of taxes that the citizens pay, which changes the amount of disposable income, which changes the amount that the citizens are going to be able to spend, which will affect the macroeconomy. Or the other way is to change the amount of spending that the government actually does. So we know that the government will actually buy about a fifth of all the final goods and services here in the United States. So they spend a lot of money. So up until now, we were talking about some of the tax acts, some of the tax breaks. How are the taxes impacted? Well, in this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about the federal budget deficit and a little bit about the spending in the Budget Control Act of 2011. So in 2011, they instituted the Budget Control Act that called for actually a substantial increase in taxes and a cut on government spending in efforts to try and address and reduce this growing federal budget deficit. Now, this Control Act was not passed until December 31st of 2012. So, almost over a year after it was actually put forth. But what they were trying to do in this act was they were trying to reduce their spending, which would reduce the federal budget deficit while increasing taxes. So we had more revenue coming in and less payments going out, trying to reduce that federal budget deficit. If you remember, right around this time, we were facing massive federal budget deficits year in and year out, and that was adding to that national debt. Our national debt around this time was actually growing rather exponentially, and they were trying to reduce that through this Budget Control Act, and they were trying to reduce that by employing less spending while also increasing taxes. So what was kind of the effect of it? Well, what they did was they increased taxes in the form of higher payroll taxes. So you didn't really see higher income taxes, but you saw higher payroll taxes. A higher tax rate on individuals making $400,000. So then on top of that, they also did impact the individual taxes, the income taxes, by saying that those that were making over $400,000, that tax rate now went up from 35 to 39.5%. If you remember, in some of the previous tax cuts, we actually saw that number go down from 39.5 to 35%. And now here it is coming up in this Budget Control Act of 2011. They started to raise that top tax bracket taxable rate in efforts to try and increase these taxes with the Budget Control Act. Also, we saw a higher tax rate on investment income for those in the top tax bracket. So that was another way that they raised taxes. Now, what was interesting is they were trying to cut government spending, but little to nothing was agreed upon for government spending. Usually what we find is whenever we're dealing with the federal budget deficit or the federal spending, that a lot of people will have their own projects within, in Congress and Senate that they want to see funded. So they often argue in order to keep their projects funded. So nobody really wanted to give up spending overall. They didn't want to give up those projects that they have money invested into. Maybe not them individually, but that was kind of their project that they want to see keep going. And there's a lot of projects like that and they deemed them necessary at one point, and they still deem them necessary. So it's really hard to try and reduce government spending because you have a lot of politicians arguing over keeping certain projects going, and we need to fund it. But overall, what it did do is it reduced the size of the federal budget deficit, but did a little for the national debt. So what it did is we actually reduced the amount of federal budget deficit, but we still had a federal budget deficit. So we didn't get to that point where we had a federal budget surplus that would help us pay down on that national debt. So it did accomplish its goal to an extent of reducing that growing federal budget deficit, but we have not gotten to the point yet where we can actually reduce that national debt.